I don't know where to begin on this topic. It feels like a year has passed since Nvidia unveiled DLSS 5 and all the shit that came with it. But it's only been like a couple of days. It's kind of nutty. But yeah, a couple of days ago, Nvidia unveiled the quote-unquote AI-powered breakthrough in visual fidelity for games, where they showcased their glorified yassification filter, basically. So real quick recap before we dive into this. Before we had DLSS 5, we had, all the previous versions of DLSS. DLSS stands for Deep Learning Super Sampling. And what that effectively means is whenever you render a frame on screen, it will take the data or the information in that frame, which is all the pixels in the frame. And while you're rendering this next frame, it will sort of try and predict what will happen in between. So it's trying to effectively predict what's gonna happen in the future from this frame, right? And it uses a deep learning algorithm that it's trained on. So based on that training data, it will try to predict where your pixels are moving. And with that, it predicts the future, sort of, and effectively interpolates between these two frames. And then that will give you, a seemingly more smooth experience. I'm not gonna lie, it's a cool piece of technology. It's cool that we have been able to take machine learning and apply it in this use case, but it comes with some issues. I personally never use it because there's a ton of artifacting I still find, and some movement is just kind of odd, and I don't know, I just don't like the effect, I guess. And for games that already run fairly okay, you'll go from 60 FPS to whatever, it's 244 or whatever, which is cool, numbers go up, nice. So the next step in the DLSS saga is DLSS 5, and this doesn't actually do this anymore. I mean, it's still doing the super sampling thing that's happening where it's predicting what's going on, but it's also changing the pixels quite drastically, I would say. So DLSS 5 takes the same data as DLSS 4, which is an important thing to note, by the way. We'll get into that in a second. But yeah, it takes the motion and the color data for each frame, and then it uses an AI model to infuse the pixels and then infuse the scene with photoreal lighting. Is how they put it. And the AI model is trained end-to-end to understand really complex scenes and semantics, like characters and hair and fabric and translucent skin and environmental lighting changes and stuff like that. If they're overcast, if they're backlit, yada, yada, yada. Everything from just analyzing a single frame. And this is interesting because one of the biggest problems with AI in general is the fact that it has a degree of uncertainty all the time, right? And that's part of why AI is so powerful, is that it's not fully deterministic. But this is fully deterministic. Because otherwise, if you were turning the camera around and you're looking at an object and you turn around and you look at it again, you would get different results. And I think in the examples they showcased, you still get a little bit of that, but not as much as you would expect when you're using, at least my understanding of when you're applying machine learning in this manner. And I guess that's been the biggest problem for them to solve. And it all runs in real time up to 4K. And since it's using the same pipeline as DLSS 4 or any previous DLSS version for that matter, integration is fairly seamless. If you've implemented DLSS for your game, it's gonna support DLSS 5 because it's still using just a color buffer and the motion vector buffer. The motion vector is sort of optional, but it looks like trash if you don't include it. So maybe now it'll be a hard, we do need the motion vector, but I don't know. A lot of people have reacted very harshly about this. And there's different aspects as to why people dislike this technology. People have sort of call it a yassification filter for games, and maybe they can make it better and make it less like that. Yeah, it's very apparent. On environments, it's one thing, but when you see any person or any faces or anything any human in the frame, it looks weird. The example they have with Grace from Resident Evil 9 is probably the most egregious one, where she looks like a freaking Instagram model. Seemingly, the negativity has by far outweigh the positives right now in terms of reception for this. If I just look at the video reveal, it has 3,000 likes and 21,000 dislikes according when I use the dislike ratio plugin. Not a lot of people are big fans of this. There's been a lot of backlash on Twitter as well. Good times. There's a big difference here in terms of like what DLSS actually does now, because it's evolved from being purely a quote-unquote performance boosting thing to actually transform visual fidelity. Now it's actually meddling with the frame and like meddling what you see. There's been video AI models that can generate photoreal pixels, but they all run offline and they all lack that like predictability that they claim to fix with this deterministic approach. And that by itself is one problem, right? This can drastically change a game's art direction and in some ways, in unintended ways. Tom's guide, I think, put it very nicely when they said that DLSS 5 has essentially shifted from showing you the game better to showing you a better version of the game, quote unquote. It functionally works very different now compared to what it did before. But it also has like some fairly obvious issues with, for instance, screen space errors, which is kind of understandable given that it only has the frame buffer to work with. You know, it's similar to, remember when we used to do, well, we still do, but you know, the screen space reflections that we have, like if you have like a puddle of water on the ground that are reflecting something, as long as you're still watching the thing that's reflecting, it will be there, but as soon as you dip down and don't look at it anymore, it disappears. That's sort of solved with like ray tracing, you know, but ray tracing is like an actual model that's running on the geometry that exists, whereas this is purely on what's on your screen. So obviously a lot of people have reacted to the look of things, but I have a different issue entirely with it. And I think the biggest issue that I see is just how you approach this as a developer. When you're making a game, how much do you take this into the like concept of making the game? Is this a thing that you just tack on at the end and then it's like, if people want to enable it, they can enable it, it will look a certain way? Or do you design your game fully with the intent that you're gonna run this with DLSS 5 and it's gonna like, this is setting the art style? When DLSS originally came out, the argument for it was that like, oh, this is something that you add to just to increase performance. And I think the biggest reason why they made it was to sort of make it possible to do more advanced rendering, like using ray tracing, and then that will render it like much lower frame rate, so like almost 30 FPS or even lower than that sometimes, and then you just like push it up to like more acceptable frame rates. There's always going to be two sides of this, right? Some people will think that, you know, a game should run natively 60 FPS. If it doesn't, then boo the developers who weren't optimizing enough, whatever. That's a whole discussion I'm not going to go into now, but I mean, there's merit to that as well. I think there's nothing wrong with that argument. I do think it's problematic when a developer thinks that if we just make the game run at a certain pace, we can use this like little thing to just boost it up and make it feel better. And I personally thought that when DLSS came out, it's not gonna really impact development that much, because I think a lot of developers do see it as like a thing that you just tack on at the end. If it fixes performance issues, those performance issues will always be there no matter what. You can't avoid that. And there are some like examples of companies where they did intend to use DLSS as like a way to get away from having to make the game performant enough. But I think those are outliners, if anything. I don't think the majority of developers feel that way. The majority of developers want their game to run great. But the implications of DLSS 5 are pretty huge compared to how it was before, because DLSS 5 has like this very fundamental change in how your game is rendered. You can derive a full art style on that, and that's something that like art direction focuses on, right? But it really changes the aesthetic in a pretty major way, I would say. You either design your game with that in mind, or you don't. And then it's up to anyone to just use it or whatever. I have a hard time finding that middle ground, because I already see this sort of problem with ray tracing. There are certain games out there where their whole visual fidelity is designed around the fact that the game will be run with ray tracing. And when you take away that, it shifts the like look of the game quite drastically, I would say, in certain cases, which means that you're sort of limiting who can play your game. You can't play it on just any hardware. You have to play it on hardware that can support ray tracing, basically. And Nvidia said that DLSS 5 do give developers, detailed control for intensity and like color grading, and they're able to mask things so that artists can determine where and how these enhancements are sort of applied so that they can still maintain each game's unique aesthetic. Okay, so even if Nvidia do give us the tools to do this, like how will this actually work? Because we already established that it uses color buffer and it uses motion vectors to determine this. So that's the input in the rendering pipeline for DLSS 5. So like how are we gonna affect the look of things with DLSS? Like are we gonna have to like sit there and prompt? If you just have the color and the motion vector, it's a post-processing filter. And I've seen people on the internet argue that like, no, they have access to the entire deferred rendering pipeline. So I saw a post on Twitter where they were like, no, see all the information that the GPU has. Like you have the depth and you have the colors and whatever. But not all games use deferred rendering, so they have to have a unified process. And I don't even know what they need more than this. So like how would that work for studios when they're sitting there be like, no, I want the human face to be 90% less human, or I want the texture of the tree to be 10% tree, like, because we're not gonna sit there in like our own engines and like tweak materials on our own materials, because it's all happening in the last stage of the pipeline. So that's not gonna happen. And it will also be up for the model's interpretation of what we mean instead of us actually doing the work, right? But it's not to say that like everything about it is bad. I do think that, some of the foliage lighting looks really cool. Some of the water rendering that they showcased have been pretty neat. But also this technology sort of extends beyond gaming. Industries like filmmaking and architecture and design could use DLSS 5 to kind of reduce production time for visual effects and enable sort of real-time photorealistic rendering as well. One area in particular I think really benefits from this actually is ArcVis, architectural visualization. I think it will really benefit them. So developers and artists argue that DLSS 5 really sucks the personality out of any artistic choice by using this sort of like averaged out guesses about what things should look like. So it's harder to like see the actual intent when it's turned on. And the technology doesn't just like risk altering realistic appearances, right? It can just straight up contradict key story elements conveyed through their graphics. In the Hogwarts Legacy example, this like 15-year-old student was suddenly rendered with so much detail, they appear like to be a much older adult. And there's also issues with like environmental lighting where, depth and contrast affects things in the scene. And I think what adds to the uncanny valley of this as well is the fact that like there are so many other limitations that we have with games, like how physics like behave in games is not always realistic. Animation is another aspect, right? Like in the example where they show where they had like characters talk, when you render this like super realistic looking person and they still move very like weird, like that kind of subtracts, I think, from the experience when you reach this like uncanny valley between. I know that like this notion of uncanny valley shifts all the time. What we felt was uncanny valley back then is now just like straight up like, oh, that just looks like garbage. It's not the uncanny valley anymore. So this will probably also shift, but that's where we are, man. I don't know what to tell you. Another thing that's also worth it to point out is that the GTC 2026 demo ran on two 5090s. So one ran the game and one ran the actual DLSS implementation or whatever. And Nvidia do say that you can run this on a single GPU, but what are the costs gonna be like for that? What are the performance costs gonna be? There's so many questions that are left unanswered. It's hard to summarize my thoughts on this because if most developers just see this like as an add-on, where you make the game that you want to make and then you add this on top of the game you're making, that I don't really think it affects too much. People can turn it on if they want to, they can turn it off if they don't like it, and the original intent is there. And for those like AI bros that love, doing just like, what would it look like if I add AI to it? Like they'll be able to do it and they'll be happy, right? So it is a little bit of a win-win in that regard, aside from the fact that the reason why I can't buy RAM right now is because of a certain bubble. So like in that regard, it's totally not worth it for me. But if it's just the fact that, oh, this is just a complementary thing to your game, then sure. I don't think a lot of developers will see it that way. I think some developers will see it as like, no, we are gonna make it with this technology in mind. And I think that's sort of the split fact comes down to, is like, you have to make that decision, right? As an art director, are we using DLSS 5 or not as the main visual communicator for our game? You know, our game is supposed to be hyper realistic. Then DLSS 5 is going to add to our intent. And that means that you have to make the game with DLSS in mind. Do you then not let people without DLSS 5 enabled play your game? I don't know, it's just a big guessing game. It's possible that the market will feel like, no, we have to jump on this bandwagon because that's what people want. But seeing from the initial reaction to this, it doesn't seem like that's the case. To me, it feels like this is just like another tool in the toolkit. If you're gonna use it as a crutch for your game, some developers are gonna do that. Some developers will not use it at all. Some developers will see it as like a complementary thing. I think we're gonna see the whole spectrum of it. It's just another thing added into the noise of development. This has always been the case with like most rendering techniques. You know, when we changed how like anti-aliasing worked, it was the same thing. Like, oh, so many options. You know, like we give players the option to change anti-aliasing technique, and if they like the artifacts that come with it, then fine, they'll use that. If they don't like it, they'll switch to something else. If I'm gonna be honest, one of the most annoying aspects of this whole week has been when Jensen Huang went out and said that like, no, they're wrong. Gamers are wrong. This is not how it works. When people were arguing that like, no, but it's just a post-processing effect. He's like, no, you're wrong. It's on the geometry level, it's on the material level, like it understands everything in that game. And then we found out that that's not true. That's not true at all. It is just color buffer, motion vectors. That's it. That's it. And effectively, that's a post-processing effect. And there's nothing wrong with it being a post-processing effect, if I'm gonna be honest. Like, there's a lot of really cool render techniques that are purely post-processing effects. But the fact that he's like trying to upsell it and make it sound more sophisticated, maybe on the like model level, it does understand geometry. Like when they trained the AI model, it understood geometry and understood materials and how they work and all that stuff. But when it comes to the game and like when you're applying it on the game level, it's a post-processing effect. And I think when he says that, he's trying to really like upsell the AI technology and like upsell AI technology as a whole. So yeah, very intense week. But I'm really curious what you guys think about it, especially for those people who are legitimately excited about this thing, or if there's just a nuance that we don't see on social media because the negativity around this is so harsh. And maybe the negativity of this is so harsh because it should be and it deserves to be. Let me know what you think. All right, that's gonna be it for me today. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.